Make sure that it doesn't say time lapse. It should just be recording normally.
Yeah, everything seems to be going good.
Okay, great. So, hi, this is Jasmine. I made that statement because the last one we took was time-lapsed on accident, and as a result, my children are currently occupied with donuts in the other room, and hopefully they stay quiet for the duration of this speech, but we'll see. So I have 3 volunteers here in the living room who do not want to be on camera. Do you guys want to say hi?
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
So, they're all there. I'm here. Time to do this speech. Now, I'm going to take a deep breath. All right. When medicinal psilocybin was put on the ballot in November of 2020 in Oregon, I didn't know anything about the compound. I was fascinated with, and I wrote a research paper on the substance because I wasn't aware of why Oregon was voting to legalize it in the first place. Now, what I learned when I did this research paper and this research was that psilocybin produces in its users a mystical experience that has a beneficial effect on the patient population in a variety of different mental illnesses and addictions. So we're going to touch on a couple things during this speech. First, we're going to examine the history and the context of psilocybin research and touch on why research was started again after a 30-year hiatus. Next, we're going to discuss the first studies in the early part of the 2000s regarding psilocybin, and these studies paved the way for additional research. And then lastly, we're going to discuss the very promising results that are coming about as a result of studies that are being done now and that have been done recently. So I'm a believer that we can't understand what's going on right now if we don't look at the past and understand what happened then. So we're going to start with the history of psilocybin within the U.S. So psilocybin was introduced to the United States in 1957 when Time magazine published an article written by a man named R. Gordon Wasson entitled Seeking the Magic Mushroom, which detailed his experiences in Mexico with a tribe that used the psychedelic mushrooms for rites of passage. He experienced it, came back, wrote about it, and some contemporaries of his from Harvard University, Timothy Leary and Richard Alper, took this information and dove into it. They identified the compound within the mushrooms, and then they started what became known as the Harvard Psilocybin Project. Now, these studies that they were doing, laced with controversy. They were also taking the drugs alongside their students. They were giving it to undergraduates. There were major problems within the studies. However, as a result of these issues, the whole thing was looked on with controversy, and they ended up being ejected from Harvard University by 1962. Now, these 2 men went on to be pop culture icons for psychedelics and psilocybin as a whole. One of the things that happened as a result of that is that psilocybin and other psychedelic drugs became associated with anti-war Vietnam protests. So in 1971, Richard Nixon passed the Controlled Substances Act, which labeled psilocybin as a Class 1 drug or a Schedule 1 drug, which means that it has a high potential of abuse. Now, the Drug Policy Alliance website stated that psilocybin doesn't really have a high potential for abuse, but that is why it was labeled as a Category 1. So in the early part of the 2000s, there's a researcher from Johns Hopkins University whose name is Roland Griffiths, and he became fascinated with this idea of sensual well-being and mystical experiences. And so he had started a meditation journey that led him down this path. Griffiths is the lead researcher at Johns Hopkins, and so one of the things that he was fascinated by was these studies from the 60s that had shown this mystical experience and overall well-being from these Harvard studies. So he and a group of his researchers got together, went to the FDA, went to the school, went to all the different regulatory approval processes, and got all the way up through federal approval to study the effects of psilocybin on healthy individuals. He's a neuroscientist, and he was already studying the effects of different drugs, but now he had the approval to study psilocybin. He was really interested. He didn't know what the effects. You're fine, just go. He didn't know what the effects of the study were going to be. So he walked into it with, quote, a healthy dose of skepticism. And in his own words, what he discovered changed his career and was, quote, unprecedented within the field of psychiatry. So the very first study that was done was a rigorous double-blind that utilized healthy adults who were psychedelic naive, as he labeled them. They had a 8-hour session where they met with the two guides who sat with them, and the two guides were licensed psychologists, and they were given, at the actual session, they were given a dose of psilocybin. The dose of psilocybin was 5 milligrams, which was well within documented, healthy, safe ranges, but was not so high as to be a dangerous amount. These participants were laid down on a couch, they were blindfolded, they had headphones put on in a controlled playlist, and for the duration of the experience, that's how they were. Now, the results were gathered immediately after the psilocybin wore off, a month after, and a year after. The repeated theme from the people right afterwards was that there was a sense of unity and connectedness. A month after the session, over 80% of participants reported feelings that the session was one of the top 5 most meaningful and spiritually significant experiences in their lives. Now, these results lasted over a year, and the improvement of emotional changes was collaborated by friends and colleagues and family. The next major study was done on 52 individuals who had life-threatening cancer, and all of these people were experiencing depression and anxiety, or both, based on clinical criteria. Prior to the session with psilocybin, patients were given extensive mood questionnaires to establish their moods. Now, they did this from their induction into the study to 6 months afterwards. The results right after the study were the best, obviously. 85% of people stated that they had acceptance of the idea of death. But at 6 months post-session, the most impressive pieces of this is that in regards to depression, there was an overall symptom remission rate of 65%. And in regards to anxiety, there was an overall symptom remission rate of 57%. So we're talking more than every 1 out of 2 people had remission of their depression or anxiety symptoms. These studies were landmark, and they paved the way for many other research institutions to be able to start studying the effects of psilocybin. So Johns Hopkins turned their attention to psilocybin in regards to mental illness. So the next study that was done, and this was actually published not so long ago, I think 2016, it was a clinical study that was led by a researcher named Alan K. Davis, and he did a large study on patients who had treatment-resistant major depressive disorder. So the results of this study mimicked the findings of the cancer study. These individuals were tested on a variety of different mental health scales, questionnaires, and before the sessions and after the sessions. At 1 week after the session, 67% of participants, quote, had a clinically significant response to the interventions. At 4 weeks post-session, it was 71% of participants who had a clinical response, and there was a staggering 54% of participants who met the criteria for remission of their treatment-resistant major depressive disorder. This is completely unheard of. The findings of this study, as well as the other studies, also corroborated the mystical experiences that had been described by the participants in the healthy study, as well as the studies from the 60s. In subsequent years, there were a variety of different studies that occurred, and they've all shown promising results around a variety of different kinds of addiction and a slew of different psychiatric disorders. Now, smoking cessation in particular had a very impressive and amazing outcome. So, in general, when we talk about smoking cessation, at 6 months post nicotine abstinence, there's about an approximate rate of 35% for abstinence. For the individuals who did a psilocybin session, the rate at 6 months after the session was 80% abstinence. We're talking more than double the ability for people to let go of nicotine. Again, within these studies and the other addiction studies, the reported feeling that was reported over and over again was connectedness and mystical experiences. So Roland Griffiths, when he's talking about the findings of these, when he's talking about the results of these studies, he impresses the fact that psilocybin could really be an alternative treatment to many different kinds of mental illness, and that it really might change the face of psychiatry and medical psychiatry as we know it. Now, these staggering results, they stress the necessity for further research, which is great, because we're opening up the doors for that to happen. So to reiterate my main ideas, I want to remind you of the key points that I've made. in the last 25 years of research. 1. Although the history is sordid, psilocybin's introduction to the West in the 1950s opened up the possibility for research now into its medicinal uses, even if it wasn't until the year 2000 that we got around to actually being able to research that. Next, we discussed the studies that were done at the beginning and how those effects of psilocybin mimicked the studies from the 60s. And then lastly, we talked about how the research has continued over the last 25 years, and it's shown just as much promise as the first studies, including some studies that are showing really amazing long-term results. Now, research has only been being done for 25 years. This is a drop in the bucket in the time frame of human experience. We have no idea what the benefits of psilocybin might end up being, and I'm really glad that Oregon is going to be there to be a pioneer for research. I'm going to hand you all my visual aid now, and I want to say thank you for listening to my speech.